For 35 years, everyone thought Dovie Pennington was dead after they took her farm. But she fought back, got the land returned.
Virginia Fury, Dovie Pennington slaughtered. 21 federal agents who hog-tied her grandson like an animal. They called her the ghost of Clinch Mountain, an old woman whose vengeance had been so complete and whose disappearance had been so absolute that the federal government spent 40 years pretending she had never existed. 21 agents had died over the course of a single month, each death more terrible than the last, each body bearing evidence of suffering that exceeded anything legitimate justice could have imposed. And then the woman responsible had vanished into mountains that had sheltered her family since before the Revolution, had disappeared so thoroughly that the most intensive search in Virginia history found nothing except the echo of footsteps that led nowhere. This is the true story of the deadliest grandmother in Appalachian history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Scott County, Virginia, in the heart of the Clinch Mountain Range, during the desperate years of the early 1940s, when the federal government was expanding its authority into regions that had governed themselves since the nation's founding. The mountains rise here in great folds of ancient rock, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before Virginia was a colony, who measured justice not by what courts decided, but by what honor demanded. You see, in Scott County during the years of our story, the federal government had begun enforcing regulations with intensity that exceeded anything previous administrations had attempted. The Revenue Service had deployed agents whose methods would have shocked the civilized world if that world had known what was occurring in hollows too remote for newspapers to reach. The moonshiners who had operated since the Revolution were being targeted with brutality that transformed enforcement into terror. The woman at the center of our story was born Dovie May Combs in 1871 in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where her family had lived since 1785. She had married young to a man named Ezekiel Pennington, had borne him 11 children, of whom 6 had survived to adulthood, had buried a husband, and watched grandchildren grow into adults who are now raising children of their own. She was 71 years old in the autumn of 1942, a grandmother whose appearance suggested nothing more threatening than the mountain hospitality that her generation had practiced throughout their lives. That's right. Dovie Pennington, known throughout the region as Granny Pennington, stood 5 feet tall, had hair that had turned white before her 50th birthday, possessed eyes that were the pale blue of winter sky, and that seemed to see through pretenses that others accepted without question. Her body was bent from 7 decades of mountain labor. Her hands were gnarled from work that had never ended, but her mind remained sharp in ways that exceeded what her appearance might have suggested. She had learned things from her grandmother that the modern world had forgotten, knowledge that had been passed from mother to daughter since the family had first arrived in these mountains over a century and a half before. She knew plants that healed and plants that killed, knew how to move through forest without leaving traces that any tracker could follow, knew techniques for survival that did not depend on supplies or tools that could be taken away. The knowledge lay dormant during the peaceful years of her widowhood, but it remained available for circumstances that would justify its use. Her grandson was named Samuel Pennington, 12 years old in the autumn of 1942, a boy whose gentle nature had made him beloved throughout the hollow where the extended Pennington family lived. Samuel was different from the other boys his age, quieter, more thoughtful, more interested in the natural world than in the rough games his cousins preferred. He was the child of Granny Pennington's youngest son, had spent more time with his grandmother than with his own parents because his grandmother understood him in ways that others did not. Samuel was small for his age, stood only 4 feet 6 inches tall, weighed less than 70 pounds, despite eating everything that was placed before him. His body had simply not grown at the rate that other children's bodies grew, a circumstance that physicians attributed to factors they could not identify, and that Granny Pennington attributed to the will of God that she did not question. His size made him vulnerable in ways that larger children were not, made him a target for those who measured worth by physical capability rather than by the qualities of heart and mind that Samuel possessed in abundance. The trouble that would transform Granny Pennington from mountain grandmother into mass murderer began with a new federal enforcement initiative that targeted the Clinch Mountain moonshine operations with intensity that exceeded anything previously attempted. A supervisor named Vernon Crawford had been assigned to lead operations in the region, a man whose ambition exceeded his judgment and whose cruelty exceeded both. Crawford had determined that breaking the moonshine culture required methods that previous administrators had been unwilling to employ. Crawford had identified the Pennington Hollow as a target because of its reputation for defiance, because family members had spoken publicly against federal enforcement, because breaking the Penningtons would send a message throughout the region. The operation he planned required a victim whose suffering would be visible, whose fate would demonstrate what resistance produced. Samuel's age and size made him ideal, young enough to break easily, small enough to humiliate in ways that would devastate his family. The raid came on the morning of October 15, 1942. Crawford led 21 federal agents up the hollow with equipment that suggested intentions beyond mere enforcement. They brought rope, lengths of hemp that had been prepared specifically for this operation, configured in ways that suggested they had researched techniques for restraining animals rather than humans. The agents did not find moonshine during their raid because there was no moonshine to find. The Penningtons still had been dismantled months before when the family had decided that the risk exceeded any benefit that continued operation might provide. But Crawford had not come for moonshine. He had come to make an example, and the absence of illegal activity would not prevent him from accomplishing his purpose. They found Samuel in the garden where he had been helping his grandmother harvest the last vegetables before winter closed in. The boy was alone. Granny Pennington had stepped inside to prepare lunch when the agents surrounded him with weapons drawn as though he were a dangerous criminal rather than a 12-year-old pulling carrots from the earth. "Where's the still?" Crawford demanded, his voice carrying authority that his position provided. "Tell us where your family hides the still, and this will go easier for you." Samuel did not know where any still was hidden, because no still existed for him to know about. His confusion was genuine, his fear was palpable, his inability to provide information that would satisfy the agents was obvious to anyone who observed him. But Crawford had not come for information. He had come to demonstrate what happened to families that resisted federal authority. "Hog-tie him," Crawford ordered. "Since he wants to act like a dumb animal, we'll treat him like one." The agents seized Samuel before he could flee, before he could call for help, before he could do anything except cry out in terror that his small lungs produced with volume that exceeded what his body size suggested. They forced him to the ground face first, pulled his arms behind his back with force that produced a scream of pain that echoed off the ridges surrounding the hollow. They tied his wrists together first, rope wrapped so tightly that circulation was immediately impaired. The hemp bit into skin that was soft from childhood, produced indentations that would become wounds as the hours accumulated. Then they bent his legs backward at the knees, pulled his ankles up toward his bound wrists, connected the restraints so that his body was arched backward in a position that the human spine was not designed to sustain. The hog-tie was complete, a child trussed like a slaughtered pig, his face pressed into dirt that his tears moistened, his body straining against restraints that would not yield regardless of how desperately he struggled, his back arched upward in a bow that placed impossible pressure on vertebrae, still growing, still developing, still vulnerable to damage that adult bones might have resisted. His arms, pulled behind him at angles that exceeded what shoulders were designed to accommodate, screamed with pain that radiated from joints being slowly separated. His legs, bent backward and connected to his wrists, created a tension that made every breath an effort, that forced his small chest to work against restraints that fought every expansion. His face was pressed into dirt that filled his nose and mouth with each desperate gasp for air. He turned his head to the side, found a position that allowed breathing, but that pressed his cheek into ground that contained rocks and roots that would leave marks through the hours that followed. "This is what happens to families that resist federal authority," Crawford announced, his voice carrying to every cabin where Penningtons had gathered to watch what was happening. "This boy will stay like this until someone provides information about moonshine operations. The longer you stay silent, the longer he suffers. The choice is yours." Samuel was positioned in the center of the hollow, visible from every cabin, placed where every member of the family would be forced to witness his suffering. The October sun beat down on his exposed back, on a body that had no protection from elements that the agents had deliberately positioned him to endure. Guards were posted to prevent any rescue attempt, rotated in shifts that ensured constant surveillance. The example that Crawford intended would be witnessed by everyone it was meant to intimidate. Granny Pennington had been inside when the agents arrived, had heard commotion that brought her to the window in time to see her grandson being forced to the ground. She had run outside, had tried to reach Samuel, had been restrained by agents who laughed at an old woman's attempts to interfere with their work. "Let him go," she screamed, her voice carrying with force that her small body should not have been capable of producing. "He's just a child. He's 12 years old. He doesn't know anything about any still. Let him go." Crawford approached her with satisfaction that he did not attempt to conceal. When someone tells us where the moonshine operation is located, the boy will be released. Until then, he stays exactly where he is. Perhaps watching him suffer will help your family remember information they seem to have forgotten. The first hours were agony that exceeded anything Samuel's young mind could process. The position placed impossible strain on his spine, forced his back to arch in ways that produced pain that radiated from his lower back throughout his entire body. The vertebrae, compressed by the unnatural curve, began to shift in ways that would prove permanent. His shoulders screamed from arms that were pulled backward, at angles that joints were not designed to accommodate. The ball and socket connections that should have moved freely were being forced toward separation, toward damage that hours of sustained pressure would make inevitable. Each minute brought new levels of pain, as muscles fatigued and joints approached their breaking points. His legs cramped from muscles that the bent position contracted continuously. The calves and thighs, forced to maintain tension that rest would have relieved, developed spasms that racked his small body with additional suffering. The cramps came in waves, periods of intense pain followed by brief relief, followed by pain that exceeded what the previous wave had produced. He cried constantly during those first hours, tears and snot and drool creating a puddle beneath his face that grew as his suffering continued. He called for his grandmother, for his parents, for anyone who might help him. He begged the guards to release him, promised to tell them anything they wanted to know, offered confessions to crimes he had not committed, if only they would end the torment that the ropes were inflicting. "Granny, Granny, please help me. It hurts so bad. Please make them stop, please." His voice carried across the hollow to where his grandmother stood, restrained by agents who would not release her. She heard every cry, every plea, every scream of pain that her grandson produced. She heard him call her name until his voice gave out, heard him whimper when screaming became impossible, heard sounds that no grandmother should ever hear a grandchild make. The guards found entertainment in his suffering, made comments about the sounds he made, and the positions his body assumed as he tried to find relief that did not exist. They poked him with sticks to produce reactions they found amusing, kicked dirt onto his face when his crying became too loud, urinated near his head so that he would be forced to smell what they had produced. The hours accumulated into a day, and the day accumulated into days, and Samuel remained hog-tied in the center of the hollow while his family watched and could do nothing. His body began to fail in ways that the sustained position inevitably produced. His spine, subjected to backward bending that it could not sustain, began to curve in ways that would prove permanent. His shoulders, pulled backward beyond their range of motion, developed damage that would never fully heal. His hands and feet, deprived of adequate circulation by ropes that were too tight, began to change colors that indicated tissue was dying. He stopped crying after the second day, not because the pain had diminished, but because his body had exhausted the resources that crying required. He lay silent and still, his eyes open but unseeing, his mind retreating from a reality that it could not endure. He had entered a state that physicians would later recognize as dissociative, a psychological defense mechanism that separated consciousness from a body that was experiencing trauma beyond what awareness could tolerate. Granny Pennington watched all of this from the window of her cabin, watched her grandson's body fail while federal agents laughed at his suffering. She was not permitted to approach him, was warned that any attempt to provide comfort would result in her own arrest and in extensions of Samuel's torment. She could only watch and listen and feel something change inside her that would not change back until 21 men were dead. Samuel was kept hog-tied for 72 hours. 3 full days of restrained agony that destroyed something in his body that would never be rebuilt, and that destroyed something in his mind that would never fully heal. When they finally released him, when Crawford decided that the example had been sufficiently made, Samuel could not stand. His legs would not support him, his spine would not straighten, his mind would not engage with a world that had permitted what he had experienced. They dumped him at his grandmother's cabin, like refuse being discarded, dropped him on the ground without care for injuries that their treatment had inflicted. Crawford stood over the boy's crumpled form with satisfaction that his expression could not conceal. "Remember this," Crawford told Granny Pennington. "Remember what happens to families that resist federal authority. Remember that we can return whenever we choose and do whatever we decide is necessary. Remember that the law protects us and abandons you." Granny Pennington gathered her grandson in arms that should have been too frail to lift him, but that love made strong enough for any burden. She carried him inside, laid him on the bed where he had slept during visits to her cabin, began examining damage that her herbal knowledge could not repair. His spine had curved into a permanent stoop that he would carry for whatever remained of his life. His shoulders had been damaged beyond recovery, would cause pain with every movement for as long as he lived. His hands and feet had suffered nerve damage from circulation that had been impaired for too long, would tremble and ache through decades of existence that the 3 days had diminished. His mind had retreated to places that her voice could not reach, had dissociated from a body that had been violated so completely that returning to full habitation seemed impossible. The boy who had helped her in the garden, who had loved the natural world, who had possessed gentleness that exceeded what his family could understand, that boy was gone. In his place was a damaged creature whose existence consisted of pain that the hog-tying had begun and that would continue long after the ropes were removed. Crawford and his agents departed, believing that their mission had been accomplished, that the example they had made would discourage resistance throughout the region. They did not understand what they had created in the cabin, where a grandmother tended a grandson, whose body and mind had been destroyed by torment that federal authority had inflicted and that federal authority refused to acknowledge. The transformation that occurred within Granny Pennington during the days following Samuel's release was absolute. The grandmother who had spent 7 decades avoiding violence, who had raised children and grandchildren with gentleness that the community respected, ceased to exist. In her place emerged something older and colder, something that drew on knowledge she had hoped to never use, something that would not rest until every man who had participated in Samuel's torture had experienced consequences that exceeded what the legal system could provide. She began her preparations immediately, gathering supplies from caches that previous generations had established against times when such supplies might be needed. She collected plants whose properties her grandmother had taught her, prepared compounds that could kill in ways that no physician would detect, and that could incapacitate in ways that would make killing easier. She studied the agents who had participated in Samuel's torture, learned their names and faces and routines through observation that no one detected. The campaign began on the night of November 1st, 1942, 2 weeks after Samuel's release. The first agent died in a manner that would establish the pattern for everything that followed. His name was Dale Tackett, and he had been one of the guards who had tormented Samuel during his 3 days of captivity. He had been among those who had poked the boy with sticks, who had kicked dirt onto his face, who had laughed at sounds of suffering that a child should never have been forced to produce. Tackett lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of Gate City, a location he believed was secure because it was distant from the Pennington Hollow and because he had taken precautions that he considered adequate. He locked his doors, kept weapons within reach, varied his routines in ways that he thought would make him difficult to predict. None of it mattered. Granny Pennington had been watching him for days, had learned his patterns despite his attempts at variation, had identified vulnerabilities that his precautions had not addressed. She entered through a window whose lock was inadequate, crossed the cabin while he slept, stood over his bed with rope in her hands, configured in the same pattern that had been used on Samuel. He woke to find himself already restrained, his wrists bound behind his back, his legs being pulled up toward the connection point. His confusion lasted only seconds before terror replaced it. before he understood what was happening and why. "Do you remember Samuel Pennington?" Granny Pennington asked, her voice carrying the flatness that had replaced emotion. 12 years old, 70 pounds. You poked him with sticks while he cried for his grandmother. You kicked dirt onto his face while he begged for mercy. Do you remember?" Tackett tried to speak, to beg, to offer explanations that might delay what was clearly coming. The hog-tie was completed before he could form words that coherence would have required. Tackett was found in his home, his body displaying evidence of restraint that matched what had been done to Samuel. His wrists and ankles were bound, his body arched backward in a position that replicated the hog-tie that the agents had employed. But Tackett had been kept in this position far longer than Samuel, had been kept until his spine had cracked from the pressure, until his shoulders had dislocated, until his body had failed in ways that death finally ended. Granny Pennington had visited him throughout the 72 hours, had described what Samuel had experienced during each phase of his suffering, had ensured that Tackett understood exactly what he was experiencing and why. She had provided water occasionally, had kept him alive long enough to experience the full duration that Samuel had endured, had extended his existence precisely to the moment when the symmetry was complete. On his chest, carved into flesh that had ceased to bleed, were the words, "For Samuel Pennington." 72 hours. The investigation that followed produced nothing useful. The murder had been conducted with skill that exceeded anything local law enforcement had encountered, had left no evidence that could identify the perpetrator. The connection to the Pennington case was obvious, but the obvious suspect, a 71-year-old grandmother, exceeded what investigators could accept as plausible. The second killing came 3 days later, claiming Robert Lawson, another agent who had participated in Samuel's torture. Lawson had been among those who had urinated near Samuel's head, who had made comments about the boy's crying, who had suggested methods for intensifying suffering that the child was already experiencing. His death matched Tackett's in its method, the same hog-tie position, the same extended duration, the same carved message on the chest. The pattern that would define November of 1942 had been established. Lawson had attempted to flee when he learned of Tackett's death, had packed belongings and arranged transportation to a sister's home in West Virginia. Granny Pennington had anticipated this reaction, had positioned herself along the route he would travel, had intercepted him at a point where isolation ensured privacy for the work that followed. His 72 hours were spent in a cave that Granny Pennington had prepared specifically for this purpose, a chamber deep enough that his screams would not reach any ears except her own. She maintained the hog-tie position with ropes that she checked and adjusted regularly, ensured that the pressure remained constant, that the suffering did not diminish through any adaptation that his body might have developed. That's right. Granny Pennington killed her victims using the same method that had been used on her grandson, forced them to experience the same position for durations that exceeded what Samuel had endured. The third and fourth killings came during the second week of November, taking agents who had attempted to flee the county when they understood what was happening. James Mitchell had made it as far as Tennessee before Granny Pennington found him, had believed that crossing state lines would provide protection that Virginia could not. It did not. William Porter had hidden in a church basement, had believed that sacred ground might provide sanctuary that secular locations had not. It did not. Both died after 72 hours in the hog-tie position, their bodies transported back to Virginia and positioned where discovery was certain. The messages carved into their chests confirmed the pattern that investigators were beginning to recognize but could not prevent. The 5th through 8th agents died during the third week, each death following the same pattern, each body found in the same position, each chest bearing the same carved message. The terror that spread through the federal task force was unlike anything law enforcement in Virginia had experienced. Crawford ordered his remaining agents to travel in groups, to maintain constant communication, to report any unusual circumstances immediately. The precautions proved inadequate. The 9th and 10th agents disappeared together, their bodies found 3 days later in a cave where they had been kept during the 72 hours that their deaths required. The 11th through 15th agents died during the 4th week of November, each death demonstrating that Granny Pennington's capabilities exceeded what anyone would have believed a woman of her age could possess. She reached them despite precautions, transported them to locations where her work could proceed undisturbed, maintained them in the hog-tie position for exactly 72 hours before ending their suffering. The 16th and 17th agents were found on November 28th, the day after Thanksgiving, their bodies positioned outside the safe house where Crawford had been hiding since the killings began. The message was clear. No location was secure, no protection was adequate. The hunter could reach anyone regardless of what measures they employed. Crawford attempted to flee on November 30th, arranged transportation that he believed was secret, planned a route that would take him far from Virginia and the vengeance that had claimed 17 of his men. He did not understand that Granny Pennington had been waiting for exactly this attempt. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides. Crawford's remaining guards, agents 18 through 20, died before they could identify the threat, before they could draw weapons that would have been useless anyway. Then Crawford was alone, his vehicle disabled, his escape blocked by a woman whose appearance suggested nothing of the fury that burned within her. She emerged from the forest with rope in her hands, hemp configured in the same pattern that Crawford's men had used on her grandson. "Do you remember Samuel Pennington?" Granny Pennington asked, her voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "Do you remember my grandson? He was 12 years old. He weighed less than 70 pounds. He had never harmed anyone in his life. Do you remember what you did to him?" Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains that might delay what was clearly coming. He claimed he had been following orders, that the hog-tying had not been his idea, that he had not personally participated in the restraint. "You ordered it," Granny replied. "You watched it. You decided how long he would suffer. You laughed while a child screamed for 3 days. Now you experience what you inflicted." What Granny Pennington did to Vernon Crawford exceeded what she had done to any of the others. His 72 hours extended to 96, a full 4 days of hog-tied agony that she maintained with care that ensured he survived until she was ready for his survival to end. She visited him throughout those 4 days, described what Samuel had experienced, ensured that Crawford understood fully what he was experiencing and why. "My grandson will never stand straight again," she told Crawford during the final hours of his existence. "His spine is permanently curved because of what you ordered. His shoulders will cause him pain for the rest of his life. His hands shake constantly. His mind has retreated to places my voice cannot reach. He is 12 years old, and you destroyed him because you wanted to make an example. Now you are the example. Now you demonstrate what happens to men who torture children in these mountains." Crawford's body was found 5 days after his disappearance, positioned in the hog-tie that had become Granny Pennington's signature. The message carved into his chest was longer than the others. Vernon Crawford, he ordered a child tortured, 96 hours, for Samuel. The final agent, number 21, was a man named Thomas Whitaker, who had been assigned to other duties during the month of killings and who had survived only by accident of scheduling. Whitaker had participated in Samuel's torture, had been among the guards who had maintained the hog-tie during the 72 hours. His survival was temporary. Granny Pennington found Whitaker on December 15th, 1942, exactly 2 months after Samuel had been bound. She found him attempting to hide in a church, believing that sacred ground might provide protection that secular locations had not. It did not. What she did to Whitaker matched what she had done to Crawford. 96 hours of hog-tied agony, 4 days during which he experienced exactly what Samuel had experienced, and more. His death completed the campaign that had claimed 21 federal agents, that had demonstrated consequences that exceeded anything the legal system could have imposed. 21 federal agents killed over 6 weeks by a woman who was 71 years old. Each had died in the same position that had been used on Samuel Pennington. Each had experienced at least 72 hours of the agony that a 12-year-old had been forced to endure. The symmetry was exact, the justice was complete, and the grandmother who had accomplished it had vanished. Granny Pennington disappeared into mountains that had sheltered her family since before the Revolution, into terrain that she knew better than any living person. The search that followed was the most intensive in Virginia history, deployed resources that exceeded anything previously assembled for a single fugitive. They found nothing, Granny Pennington had become a ghost, and ghosts do not leave trails that dogs can follow. She found a location that no search would discover, a cave system deep in the Clinch mountain range that her grandmother had shown her when she was a child. The caves extended into the mountain for nearly a mile, contained chambers that had been used by her family during times when hiding was necessary. The entrance was concealed by rock formations that appeared to lead nowhere, required knowledge that only those who had been shown could possess. She made her home in chambers that had been improved by previous generations, expanded the habitation over years of work that transformed refuge into something approaching permanence. The main chamber she occupied was approximately 25 feet across, had a ceiling high enough to stand without stooping, received light from a crack in the rock above that served as both illumination and ventilation. She built upon what her ancestors had created, added improvements that her circumstances required. She constructed a fire pit that vented through natural fissures in the rock, that allowed cooking and heating without producing smoke that might be visible from outside. She built storage spaces for the food she would need to survive winters that could last 5 months. She created a living space that was simple but adequate, that sustained existence for both herself and the damaged grandson, who would share it with her. She established gardens in clearings that the caves accessed, developed systems for survival that required no contact with the world that had destroyed her grandson. The first gardens failed almost entirely, planted in soil that proved too poor and in locations that received insufficient sunlight. She learned from the failures, amended soil with materials gathered from the forest floor, selected varieties that the conditions could support. Potatoes became their staple, hardy enough to survive the mountain conditions and nutritious enough to sustain them through winters when nothing else grew. She grew varieties that her grandmother had cultivated, seeds that carried connections to generations stretching back to the family's arrival in these mountains. Beans and squash provided variety. Herbs provided medicine and flavoring. Roots that grew wild in the forest supplemented what her gardens produced. Samuel remained with her for the first 5 years of her isolation, brought to the caves by family members who understood that he could not survive in a world that had permitted what happened to him. She cared for him through years of slow recovery that never approached completeness, tended damage that her love could not repair, watched a grandson whose mind remained in places that her voice could not consistently reach. The care that Samuel required was constant and exhausting. His body, damaged by the 72 hours of hog-tying, could not perform tasks that healthy bodies performed without thought. His curved spine caused pain with every movement, required positions and supports that Granny Pennington learned to provide. His damaged shoulders limited what his arms could accomplish, required her to perform tasks that he would have done himself if his body had remained whole. His mind was the greater challenge. The dissociation that had protected him during the torture had not entirely lifted when the torture ended. He existed in states that varied from awareness that approached normalcy to retreats that took him to places her voice could not reach. Some days he recognized her, spoke to her, engaged with the world around him. Other days he stared at walls that seemed to contain visions only he could see, responded to sounds only he could hear, lived in a reality that intersected with hers only occasionally. She developed routines that provided structure for both of them, rituals that gave meaning to days that might otherwise have been formless. She woke him each morning with the same words, prepared meals at the same times, performed activities in sequences that his damaged mind could learn to anticipate. The routines provided anchors that helped him remain present in a world that had given him every reason to retreat. She told him stories during the long winter evenings, tales that her grandmother had told her and that she had told her own children. She described the world outside their caves, places she had seen and experiences she had accumulated during the years before isolation had claimed her. She kept his mind engaged as best she could, fought the retreat that the trauma continually encouraged. He died in 1947 at the age of 17, his body finally surrendering to damage that 5 years of care could not overcome. The end came gradually, a weakening that accelerated over his final months, until his body simply stopped. His death was peaceful. He simply went to sleep one night and did not wake. But the peace of his dying could not compensate for the violence of his living. Granny Pennington buried Samuel in the cave that had sheltered them both, dug the grave herself despite age that made such labor almost impossible. She worked for 3 days to create a resting place that honored the grandson she had loved, carved a headstone from rock that the cave provided, created a memorial that would endure as long as the mountain itself. She spoke words over his burial that combined prayer with promises. "You are safe now," she said. "No one can hurt you anymore. No one can tie you like an animal anymore. I killed them all, Samuel. Every man who participated in what they did to you. They died the same way they made you suffer, only longer. They understood what they had done before they died. Rest now. I will join you when God decides my time has come." The grief that followed Samuel's death nearly destroyed her. She had survived the killing of 21 men, had survived 5 years of caring for a broken child, had survived isolation that would have broken anyone with less determination. But his death created emptiness that threatened to end her existence more surely than any physical hardship could have accomplished. She lay beside his grave for days, unable to eat or tend the fire or perform any of the tasks that survival required. She contemplated joining him immediately, considered methods that would end her existence and bring reunion that waiting seemed unable to promise. Something stopped her. Perhaps the stubbornness that had allowed her to kill 21 men. Perhaps the knowledge that her story would die with her if she did not survive to tell it. She continued living in the caves for 38 more years after Samuel's death, maintained her existence through determination that exceeded what anyone would have believed a woman of her age could possess. She reached the age of 110, became the oldest person in the Virginia mountains, and possibly the oldest person in the entire state. She visited Samuel's grave every day that her health permitted, spoke to him as she had spoken to him when he was alive. She told him about her days, asked his opinions about decisions that survival required, maintained a relationship that death had interrupted, but had not ended. She kept journals throughout her isolation, documented her days and thoughts in notebooks she made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals contained confessions that she intended to survive her, truths that she believed the world should eventually know. "I killed 21 men," she wrote in an entry from 1975, 33 years into her isolation. "I killed them because they hog-tied my grandson like an animal for 72 hours and destroyed his body and his mind. I killed them the same way they tortured him, only I made them suffer longer. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again, would do it 1,000 times, would do it for every child who has ever been tortured by men with badges who believe their authority makes them immune to consequence." Granny Pennington died in her cave on October 15, 1985, exactly 43 years after Samuel had been bound. She was 114 years old, had outlived everyone who might have remembered her, had maintained her existence through determination that exceeded what anyone would have believed possible. Her body was found 3 years later, in 1988, by spelunkers who had discovered the cave system during explorations that no one had previously attempted. They discovered the chambers she had made her home, the evidence of 43 years of solitary existence, Samuel's grave that she had tended until the day she died, the journals that documented everything. The journals were initially dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed hermit, but investigators who examined the details found correspondence with cold cases that had been unsolved for over 4 decades. The victims matched. The method matched. Everything Granny Pennington had written was confirmed by evidence that she could not have known unless she had been present when the events occurred. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: grandmother vengeance, impossible survival, cold cases solved after 4 decades, and a woman who had lived alone in caves for 43 years while authorities assumed she was dead. Granny Pennington was buried beside Samuel in the cave that had sheltered them both. The inscription that family members placed above their graves reads, "Dovie May Pennington, 1871-1985, and Samuel Pennington, 1930-1947. They bound him like an animal." She answered, "Together in these mountains forever." The songs that emerged from the Granny Pennington story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of a child hog-tied for 3 days and the fury of a grandmother who killed 21 men using the same method they had employed. The first verse describes Samuel before the raid, the gentle boy who loved nature, the grandson who was the light of an old woman's existence. The melody was warm and protective, suggesting innocence that should have been sacred. The second verse described the hog-tying 72 hours of a child bound like a slaughtered animal while federal agents laughed at his suffering. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Samuel's release, the broken boy whose body would never straighten and whose mind would never fully return. The melody grew quiet and mournful, suggesting damage that exceeded what death would have represented. The fourth verse described Granny Pennington's transformation, the grandmother who became something else, as she watched a grandson retreat into pain that her love could not reach. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting fury that would not be denied. The fifth verse described the campaign, 21 agents dying in the same position they had imposed on a child, each experiencing 72 hours or more of the agony they had inflicted. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting justice that age could not prevent. The final verse described the 43 years of hiding, the grandmother who cared for a broken grandson until his death, and then continued alone, the mountains that sheltered them both until they were finally discovered together. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however extreme, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Granny Pennington rests beside the grandson she avenged, to read the inscription that speaks of binding and answering, and mountains that shelter forever? Would you walk through the caves where she survived for 43 years? Would you try to understand how love could sustain a life that had lost everything except memory and determination? The journey to Scott County is easier now than it was in 1942, the roads paved, and the world more connected than it was when federal agents hog-tied a 12-year-old to make an example of his family. But the mountains remain ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of grandmothers and grandchildren rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of Virginia Fury, the grandmother named Dovie Pennington, who slaughtered 21 federal agents and vanished for 43 years into caves that no search ever discovered. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when discovery brought truth that the world needed to hear. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Granny Pennington killed 21 federal agents who had hog-tied her 12-year-old grandson for 72 hours, killing each one using the same method, then disappeared into caves for 43 years until her body was found beside the grandson she had cared for until his death. What about you? If federal agents hog-tied your 12-year-old grandson for 3 days, while you watched helplessly, if he emerged with a spine that would never straighten and a mind that would never fully return, could you kill 21 men at the age of 71 using the same method they had employed? Could you survive alone in caves for 43 years, first caring for the broken child and then continuing alone after his death? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some grandmothers love their grandchildren so completely that 43 years of isolation is merely the space between torture and reunion. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the grannies who call them home.